Thank you, Sherwin. When I first saw David Beals' topic on the program, Living in a Multicultural Society, and I learned that he is a Californian who lives in Berkeley, my mental stereotyping mechanism immediately clicked in. Oh, he's a Californian. Naturally, he's interested in multiculturalism. After all, what could be more multicultural than California? In reading his bio, I saw that he is a scholar of impeccable credentials, educated at Harvard, at the UC Berkeley, and at Hebrew University, and now Emanuel Ringelbaum Professor of Jewish History at the University of California at Davis. But when I saw the range of topics he has studied and written about, my interest really piqued up. I realized that this is one scholar who cannot be pigeonholed. His books include Gershom Scholem, Kabbalah and Counterhistory, Power and Powerlessness in Jewish History, both of these books recipients of National Book Awards, and Eros and the Jews, From Biblical Israel to Contemporary America, which, by the way, is on the book table in the lobby. He is currently working on a study of the symbolism of blood in Jewish and Christian traditions, for which he received a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a work on modern Jewish thought, the invention of Judaism. Now, I like to consider myself an eclectic, but really, for one scholar's academic interest to cover such a wide range of bases seemed unusual, to say the least. So I was eager to meet David Biale and find out more about what makes this versatile mind tick. I became even more intrigued as I heard his perceptive comments and questions throughout this weekend. One thing I wondered about was his name, which doesn't exactly sound Jewish. And so, emboldened by Lisa Byer's rather blunt question to Derek Penslar yesterday, when I sat down with David at lunch, I asked him whether Biale was his original name. And sure enough, it turned out that his father, sometime after emigrating to the United States from Poland, had shortened the original family name of Biale. David grew up in Los Angeles in an intensely secular Zionist household. His identity, he says, was formed around Israel. He ultimately spent 6 years there on and off, and is married to an Israeli, Rachel Biale, who is the author of Women in Jewish Law. Growing up out of the mainstream, he became interested in Jewish heresy, a topic that certainly resonates with many of us. His dissertation was on the thought of Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Kabbalah, who later, as I've said, became the subject of one of David's award-winning books. Scholem, David told me, rejected the idea that Judaism has a single essence. He was interested in the interplay of opposites, the rational and the irrational. Biale quoted to me something Scholem had said about Israel, that the Jewish state frees Jews to be what they want to be, a freedom that David Biale seems to have exploited to the maximum. David describes himself as a cultural historian, an umbrella designation that covers a multitude of interests. He is interested in all aspects of Jewish culture, past and present, from intellectual history to pop culture. He teaches courses on Holocaust, modern history of modern Israel, sexuality and family and Jewish tradition, and history of apocalyptic thought. What ties all of these topics together, David told me, is that they are all aspects of Jewish culture. He is, one might say, the quintessential cultural Jew. His most recently edited book, a thick compendium called Cultures of the Jews, which is also out there on the book table, won the National Jewish Book Award. He is a member of the Board of Jewish Social Studies. He edited a book called Insider Outsider, American Jews and Multiculturalism, which focuses on how Jews orient themselves to living in a multicultural America. And so that brings us to his topic of this morning. I asked him how this topic ties into the conference theme, Jews and non-Jews, the love-hate relationship. You'll see, he said. And so it is with great anticipation that I now introduce David Biale.
Well, Ruth, thank you for that very comprehensive and lovely introduction. And you can see why, if I told her what I was going to talk about, then she would have covered the lecture. And so I had to withhold something here. Let me start. Ruth actually wanted to know what makes my mind tick. And this morning, it's this Starbucks coffee. That's otherwise... I'm not sure what would happen. I want to start actually by thanking Sherwin for inviting me here, and if I can take the liberty to speak for all of my colleagues here on the panel for bringing us together in a really very interesting combination of journalists and academics, and we would not normally, I assume, meet and talk in this kind of a setting. So I'm very grateful to you, and as a Californian, I'm also... As a Californian, I'm also grateful that he decided to hold this in October here and not in January, because otherwise I assume we'd be talking about God's frozen people. Now, sorry, I actually never tell jokes when I lecture, so I'm not going to try to compete with Zev here because I'm going to fall flat on my face, but since people have been talking a little bit, giving some personal anecdotes, I thought I'd tell you something that's I just got an email yesterday, and this ties in with our discussion yesterday of whether Jews are white or when Jews became white, which is very related to the question of multiculturalism. And this is a very odd thing. I'm to appear as an expert witness in a trial on Tuesday. A case brought by a group of Jewish prisoners from San Quentin prison. And they have brought a suit against the prison for housing them together, or classifying them as whites and housing them with other white prisoners, many of whom are white supremacists. And so they wish to be reclassified, and so I'm supposed to testify to the fact that Jews are not white. This is going to be a hard act, I think. I expect that I'm really going to fall flat in my face. But just to make this case a little bit more interesting, the lead plaintiff goes by the name of Viet Minh Mike, and as you can tell from his name, his parents were not Polish Jews. So this should be a very interesting experience. Okay, now. As they used to say on Monty Python, now for something completely different. My talk today, and it is different because I'm interested actually, as opposed to some of my colleagues here who have spoken either as political social historians or as sociologists, I'm actually interested in cultural representations of Jews in our culture. And I'm going to be talking here about, the first half of my talk is about contemporary America, which is what I was asked to talk about, but as an historian I can't resist the urge to also talk about some historical analogies, and I'm going to sort of do a fast reverse to the to ancient history in the second half of the talk, so prepare for a sort of wild ride. Now, in a recent episode of the popular TV sitcom Sex and the City, Charlotte, the stereotypical WASP Episcopalian, has converted to Judaism to marry Harry in a traditional Jewish wedding. At a later point, she prepares a Shabbat meal, and in the midst of the blessings, discovers that he's watching a basketball game on TV with the sound off. Outraged at his gauche behavior, she exclaims, "If I could give up Christianity for you, you can give up basketball for me." Now, this scene, and indeed the whole premise of this relationship, violates the code that has pervaded Hollywood's depiction of Jewish men and Jewish and non-Jewish women, which is the typical relationship rather than Jewish women and non-Jewish men, since at least the first talking picture, Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer. In this long tradition, Jewish men search for sexual satisfaction and marital bliss in the arms of the proverbial shiksa. Indeed, the classic statement of America's melting pot, Israel Zangwill's 1908 play of that name, Melting Pot, has at the core of its plot the romance between a Russian Jewish refugee in America and the daughter of a Russian officer who commanded the Russian army during the Kishinev pogrom. If these two could overcome their European enmity and find love in America, then surely the melting pot would work its magic on other antiquated hatreds. Now, I don't think it's necessary to rehearse the history of such inter-ethnic romances and intermarriages in American fiction and film to reinforce this point. One thinks of Philip Roth's 1969 novel, Portnoy's Complaint, as the most outrageous exploration of the mythic allure of the Gentile, an outrageousness that is predicated on the fact that the stereotype was already long in place. In fact, whether writers like Roth or the Jews who invented Hollywood were reflecting their own identity struggles or anticipating the anxieties of American Jews generally, they created these images in advance of the true intermarriage epidemic, if you want to use that word, which we heard about yesterday and whose dimensions hover somewhere 40 to 50%. It is such images rather than statistics that are what interest me here, because the images both shape and reflect dominant cultural mentalities, quite apart from whether they are objectively representative. And these cultural mentalities are precisely what is at stake in trying to understand the place of Jews in America's multicultural society. Now, to be sure, the long history of these cultural representations has its surprising moments. The 1971 movie, The Way We Were, starring Robert Redford and Barbra Streisand, has an unexpected conclusion. Streisand plays a Jewish communist from a working-class background in the late 1930s and 1940s who falls in love with a conservative upper-crust Gentile played by Robert Redford. Their improbable relationship eventually falls apart under the impact of McCarthyism, and they divorce. At the end of the movie, though, they meet momentarily some years later, each one now married to his or her appropriate ethnic mate. Returned to her own identity, the Streisand character seems to stand for the political and erotic affirmation of Jewish identity and refutation of the possibility of finding marital satisfaction in the arms of the Gentile other. Yet the overwhelming nostalgia with which the doomed romance between Jew and Gentile is presented subtly undermines its overt message. The way we were is not the way we should be. Each character may have found his or her destined partner, but true love remains the sole property of the failed intermarriage. Something, though, and this is, I think, where I depart from some of the things we heard yesterday, something, though, has changed to make possible a scenario like the recent one in Sex and the City. Now it is no longer necessary to create romance between Jews and non-Jews. It's even permissible to convert the non-Jew to Judaism. In fact, Charlotte is the better Jew, as she demonstrates in her reproof of Harry, whose true religion seems to be sports, marking him as a real Americanized male. What is most surprising is that this affirmation of both ethnicity and religion comes at a time when intermarriage rates are really soaring. One might even conclude that the allure of the shiksa, to use Philip Roth's language, comes precisely when she is not particularly available. But when she becomes available, intermarriage as such loses its appeal and is replaced by a desire to convert her to Judaism. Crossing boundaries is only seductive when they are unreachably high, not when they have virtually disappeared. Parenthetically, this process of what I'd like to call the ethnicization of intermarriage is not only taking place in American culture with respect to Jews. The extraordinary success of the recent independent film, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which was the highest grossing independent film actually in American history, is linked to the same dynamic. Here, instead of the Greek girl abandoning the family and its tribe, the non-Greek boyfriend, whose WASP parents are utterly sexless, converts to Greek orthodoxy. And in fact, what was really interesting to me about this film is that the confluence of religion and ethnicity among the Greeks appears precisely analogous to the same phenomenon in American Judaism. To join the ethnic group, therefore, is to liberate one's sexuality. That the old stereotypes have undergone a tremendous transformation can also be demonstrated from what is my personal religion, namely the program Seinfeld, the most popular sitcom in modern television history. And I'm not a person who believes much in ritual. I don't belong to a synagogue. But my wife and I do have an evening ritual, and that is we watch the reruns of Seinfeld. And God forbid there should be a baseball game that bumps it. We will not watch reruns on tape. They must be on television. That's ritual for you. Now, for those who are not aficionados of the show, all the characters in Seinfeld appear to be Jewish, but only the main character, Jerry Seinfeld, is actually marked as such. Now, Jerry Stiller, who plays George Costanza's father, has quipped that the Costanzas, who are represented as Italian, are really Jews in a witness protection program. Now, most of Jerry Seinfeld's romantic possibilities on the show, few of whom last more than one episode, would appear to be Gentiles. But his inability to maintain any lasting relationship with these women has less to do with some stereotyped Jewish neurosis than with the bizarre idiosyncrasies of the main characters of the show. Rather than focusing on Jerry's pursuit of the proverbial shiksa, the obvious comic route from earlier American entertainment, Seinfeld lampoons the myth in an episode in which the Gentile character Elaine has trouble fighting off first a bar mitzvah boy, then her Jewish boss, and finally a rabbi. Her problem, she is told, is her shiksa appeal. The success of this satire depends on the persistence of the myth of the shiksa, but also on the belief that the myth itself has begun to lose its hold. It seems increasingly clear that as the rate of intermarriage goes up, the anxieties over it, at least as expressed in popular culture, I'm not talking about the anxieties of Jewish functionaries, seems to be going down. In two unusual episodes, however, Jerry's girlfriend, Rachel, is not only Jewish, but explicitly Orthodox. And why is another story, which I won't go into because it would take us into a different episode. But in one of these episodes, Jerry and Rachel, unable to have sex because she lives with her parents and his parents are staying in his apartment, make out during Schindler's List. His neighbor, Newman, finds him out and reports him to his parents. And they accost him and they say, "How could you make out during Schindler's List?" So he becomes an ethnic outlaw for refusing to take the iconic Holocaust film with proper seriousness. But the fact that for once his partner is also Jewish suggests that the show's satirical treatment of Schindler's List must be read as a kind of internal Jewish debate. Should the sexual desire of these two Jews, no matter how adolescent, and of course all of this is a kind of adolescent behavior, take back seat to the Holocaust? By lampooning Schindler's List in this way, it was right when the film came out, so this is a pretty daring thing to do. Seinfeld reveals an astonishing lack of anxiety about the two issues that one might think American Jews are most anxious about: anti-Semitism and sex. I don't wish to minimize the existence of both of these anxieties, linked or unlinked, but I do think that Seinfeld, like Sex and the City, may reflect a new stage in American Jewish culture. Now, how should we define this new stage? The history of Jews in America is, of course, as old as the country itself. But just focusing on the 20th century, we notice something interesting. The Jews, who had been the paradigmatic minority in Europe, I think as Yehuda Bauer pointed out to us, and whose treatment became the litmus test of the modern nation state, now turn out to be only one minority among many, and hardly the paradigmatic one. To be sure, anti-Semitism has never been absent from the American scene, but it may be regarded as one species among many challenges to a liberal democracy, not as the main or only one. And I think that it's pretty hard for Jews to accept the fact that we are not the paradigmatic minority. The struggle for the civil rights of African Americans is, in fact, the paradigmatic one for America, not the integration of the Jews. Indeed, Jews were able to lend considerable support to the civil rights movement because by the 1960s, they had already achieved much of the equal status for which African Americans were fighting. Now, as I suggested in a book that Ruth mentioned, Insider Outsider, American Jews and Multiculturalism, since we're promoting product out there on the table, I'll take the opportunity to do so. I argue with my co-editors that American Jews can claim to be at once insiders who are outsiders and outsiders who are insiders. They are at one and the same time a minority and part of the majority. This assimilation into the majority culture occurred in the years after World War II as native-born and English-speaking Jews overshadowed those born in Europe. As Karen Sachs put it, and as Lynn mentioned yesterday, Jews became white folks. Will Herberg's 1955 classic, Protestant Catholic Jew, turned Jews into the third leg of the American religious trinity. Yet, Jewish consciousness remains split between this new acceptance into the American mainstream and a continued sense of minority status. The Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War reinforced and catalyzed this dual consciousness, since on the one hand they fed a sense of vulnerability, but on the other hand they opened the doors to unprecedented Jewish influence in Washington. The story of Jewish power and influence in America is a story then of this dual consciousness, a minority that can act like part of the majority while still continuing to think like a minority. It's been said, by the way, about Israel that it has a minority that thinks like a majority and a majority that thinks like a minority. And to some extent, this can be seen mapped onto American Jews as well. Now, the building of the Holocaust Museum in Washington symbolizes this duality. On the one hand, the Jews succeeded in telling their story on the sacred ground of the Washington Mall before either African Americans or Native Americans could even break ground. This is surely as powerful a sign of belonging to the power elite as any. At the same time, the story that is told is of the persecution of a uniquely vulnerable minority. But the vulnerability is, of course, European, not American. Thus, the subliminal subtext of the Holocaust Museum is that the American Jewish community is different from its European, and for that matter, Israeli cousins, secure, powerful, and integrated. I had the opportunity, since our hotel was right across the street from the new Holocaust Museum here in the Detroit area, I went over and took a look at it, and there it is between a Chinese restaurant on one side and a bank on the other. And I thought that was really quite a remarkable commentary. I'm not sure what it's a commentary of, but it's a commentary. Now, Jews have achieved this unprecedented status in a period that might be called America's second wave of multiculturalism, starting in the late 1960s. The first wave was the result of the great immigration to America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The second wave corresponds to the civil rights movement and the new mass immigrations from Latin America and Asia since the 1970s. Ethnic self-identification came to occupy a central place in American politics and culture, and thus made it possible for Jews to proclaim their identity without earlier fears of abandoning the dream of American acceptance. But this same period also corresponds, and this point I think has not been made before that clearly, it also corresponds to the latest religious awakening in America, a phenomenon of awakenings that started in the 1730s and have recurred repeatedly in the centuries since. The rise of evangelical Christianity has had the unexpected consequence of making Orthodox Judaism and support for Israel respectable among segments of the population, which we discussed yesterday, that might be assumed to be susceptible to traditional Christian anti-Semitism. The alliance between Jews and evangelicals is one of the more curious phenomena of the past 2 decades, and completely overturns earlier assumptions that Jews would prosper most in secular societies. The contrary now appears to be at least temporarily true. And of course, America is secular politically, but not, as Tocqueville noted, in terms of its civil society. So the contrary now appears to be at least temporarily true. If we look, for example, at the question of support for Israel, which of course is not the best benchmark, but it is one, the percentage of secular Americans who are strongly supportive of Israel is about the same as for secular Europeans. It's around 25%, while the percentage of American Christians, and especially evangelicals, is about 3 times as high. And the role of evangelical Christians in contemporary America points out the necessity to include the Orthodox Jews in our story of the recent American Jewish identity. What is most distinctive about Orthodoxy today is not its own ivory tower institutions, such as the Lakewood Yeshiva, thriving though they are, but the way certain segments of the Orthodox world have engaged and even dominated the interaction between Jewish and American culture. 2 examples come to mind. The Simon Wiesenthal Center represents a fascinating use by an Orthodox institution of the Holocaust to make a broader point about interethnic relations in our own society. So although the Wiesenthal Center often takes the role of a Jewish advocacy lobby, it does so by making a larger claim on American values. The second example, and I'm sure these are examples that won't be too popular with this crowd here, the second example is Lubavitch. As Sue Fishkoff's fascinating recent study of Lubavitch shows, the missionary dynamism of Chabad has turned it into a force in American culture generally. Witness the lighting of giant Hanukkah menorahs in public places around the country, or the Chabad telethon in Los Angeles, which improbably brings some of Hollywood's biggest celebrities, including my recently elected governor, with Haredi Jews to raise millions of dollars for drug rehabilitation. Whatever one might think of Lubavitch, it would be impossible to deny that it has put an entirely unprecedented stamp on both Jewish culture and American culture and on the relationship between them. Jews have therefore benefited from 2 different, possibly even contradictory trends in contemporary America: multiculturalism and Christian pietism. But it is also important to recognize that these developments in American culture have not taken place independent of Jewish input. America is famously a country where immigrants have had the ability to reinvent themselves. But this characteristic of America is not an immutable and internal given. It is something that Americans have created, and Jews have perhaps contributed as much as any other group towards the definition of America as an open society. Indeed, Jews have typically used their own experiences to reshape America in ways that made it more hospitable for themselves. So, for example, the play that I've already mentioned, Zangwill's Melting Pot, used the story of a Russian Jewish immigrant to advance its argument for an American crucible that would melt away all ethnic differences. Yet in subtle ways, the play makes this argument not so much by stripping its Jewish characters of their Jewish characteristics, but on the contrary, it's a kind of a subtext, making America more Jewish. Despite its title, The Melting Pot actually treats the Jews as the model towards which this new America would correspond. Its assimilationist message contains an undercurrent of Jewish ethnic pride. Thus, for example, the feisty Irish house servant, who initially denounces Jewish religious practices in virtually anti-Semitic terms, ends up speaking Yiddish and celebrating Purim. It's interesting that it's that holiday, Purim, with all of its associations that we heard before. Jews, it transpires, are not just any immigrant group, but the quintessential Americans. In his book, In Search of American Jewish Culture, Stephen Whitfield has demonstrated how Jewish cultural production reshaped American popular culture, and thus the very definition of America throughout the 20th century. In one of his favorite examples, he points out that the most commercially successful song in American history, White Christmas, was written by a Jew, Irving Berlin, who succeeded in turning a religious holiday into an exclusively meteorological event. One can hardly think of a strategy more effective to make America safe for the Jews than preserving a Christian icon while obscuring its Christology. It is examples like this that bring us back to Seinfeld and Sex and the City. No longer is it necessary, it would seem, for Jews to operate under cover, as one might argue Irving Berlin did in White Christmas. Not only are the Jewish themes front and center, but they now subvert many of the cliches and myths of earlier American Jewish culture. Philip Roth's unattainable shiksa now converts to Judaism in order to get her man. At the risk of oversimplification, Instead of Jews becoming American, America becomes Jewish. As a multicultural open society, America's identity is therefore constantly in the process of renegotiation, a process to which minorities themselves increasingly make major contributions. In this respect, America is relatively unique, since other societies in which Jews have been able to take an active part have generally been less receptive to such redefinitions. For example, we know that many Jews became thoroughly Hellenized in late antiquity. I'm going to talk more about this in a moment. But there is little evidence that Jewish writings in Greek significantly reshaped Greco-Roman culture, unless, of course, we consider the long-term impact of the New Testament. That's a pretty big accept. But in any case, they didn't influence it in what we would call a direct fashion. Nevertheless, America is not the first multi-ethnic society in which Jews have lived. Now I come to the second part of my talk, and it may be useful to examine how the specific issues of intermarriage and miscegenation, which seem to be such markers of Jewish life in America, have their analogs in earlier periods of Jewish history. The reason for this quest is in part to demonstrate that the American experience is somewhat less unique than we frequently assume, but it will also help us define the ways in which America is different. Indeed, the tensions in contemporary American Jewish life between, on the one hand, communal anxiety about intermarriage, and on the other, the acceptance of it in popular culture, have their precise reflections in earlier periods in Jewish history. A good example of this tension can be found in the biblical period itself, and so I turn to the Bible as the ancient version of Hollywood. On the one hand, the book of Deuteronomy states, "When the Lord your God brings you to the land that you are about to enter and possess, and he dislodges many nations before you, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites," remember those nations, "7 nations much larger than you, you shall not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons." An even more vivid denunciation of sexual relations with foreigners as idolatrous is the sin of Baal Peor in Numbers chapter 25. While wandering in the desert, the Israelites fornicate with Moabite women and then sacrifice to the Moabite god Baal Peor. To take foreign lives led to idolatry because the covenant with God was understood, especially in the prophetic literature, as a metaphorical marriage. Despite this legal and theological exclusivism, however, the biblical narratives are filled with intermarriages. Machlon to Ruth, Judah to the daughter of the Canaanite Shua, Joseph to the Egyptian Asnat, and Solomon, well, you can't count how many wives he had from foreign countries. Bathsheba, Solomon's own mother, was married to Uriah, a Hittite. That's why I asked you to remember the Hittites. Although Uriah's name suggests Uriah, it has the Yah particle in there, possibly was a worshiper of the Israelite God. Some historians try to explain this contradiction between law and narrative by arguing that the legal bans on intermarriage were late developments in biblical history. They point out that Ezra the scribe waged a campaign against intermarriage in the period after the return from the Babylonian exile. But there's a good deal of seemingly early material that suggests disapproval, such as Rebekah's disgust with Esau's choice of Hittite women, again we have Hittite women, and the opposition of Samson's parents to his Philistine wife. In fact, despite Ezra's ban, disputations over intermarriage persisted through Second Temple times. Only with rabbinic law did a ban on intermarriage become more or less an accepted social norm. And even then we have to wonder, just because it's in rabbinic law doesn't mean that it was the case. It would appear that for ancient Jewish culture as a whole, the issue was one that aroused great ambivalence and controversy. 2 stories capture this ambivalence. The first is in the Samson cycle, Judges 13 to 16. Samson marries one Philistine woman, has relations with a Philistine prostitute, and finally falls in love with Delilah, who, although not ethnically identified, is certainly an ally of the Philistines, if not a Philistine herself. Yet the narrator's position on the sexual deceit practiced by these women is far from negative. He or she interjects a comment, probably he, interjects a comment when Samson's parents oppose his choice of a Philistine wife. Quote, "His father and mother did not realize that this was the Lord's doing. He was seeking a pretext against the Philistines, for the Philistines were ruling over Israel at that time." In each case, Samson's submission to feminine wiles leads to a violent confrontation with the Philistines in which he ends up killing hordes of Israel's oppressors. What appears to be his downfall, in fact, is revealed as the vehicle for national salvation. In this way, the narrator depicts sexual relations with a foreigner as covertly orchestrated by God to serve Israel's political ends. An equally conflicted tale is the story of Jacob's daughter Dinah in Genesis 34. And to remind you, Shechem, a Hivite, again, a nation listed in that list of 7 according to Deuteronomy. So Shechem, a Hivite, rapes Dinah and then proposes marriage to her. Jacob accepts the offer as a way of settling his family in the land, but his sons, portrayed as better protectors of their sister than their father, object. They demand that the Shechemites circumcise themselves as the price for obtaining Dinah, a ruse that renders them temporarily unable to defend themselves. This is an interesting twist on rationale for circumcision.
It is like Hollywood.
That's why I used that. I wasn't joking. People laugh, but I wasn't joking. While they were recovering from the operation, Simon and Levi charge in and slaughter them, and the other brothers pillage the town. The punishments of the Shechemites fit the crime. The organ that committed the rape becomes the device through which Jacob's sons are able to avenge their sister. Yet, before we jump off and say that's the only meaning of the story, this story is not a simple account of vengeance for a sexual crime, but rather a struggle over intermarriage. Contradictory voices compete in the narrative. The Shechemites themselves are presented in certain verses as far from hostile to the Israelites. They propose that the two peoples intermarry, and Jacob acquiesces. In order to make Jacob's position more plausible, the rape needs to be turned into romantic seduction. Thus, immediately after verses describing the rape, we read the following. Being drawn strongly to Dinah, daughter of Jacob, and in love with the maiden, he spoke to the maiden tenderly. Doesn't sound like a rapist. So are we dealing here with rape or seduction? The text presents both possibilities. Although Dinah herself, this is an important point, I think, remains silent. The controversy over intermarriage is fought by men over her passive body. Although the narrator of Genesis 34 seems to favor Simon and Levi, the claims of Jacob, who of course is the eponymous father of all the Israelites, cannot be easily dismissed. In his deathbed testament, he curses Simon and Levi, quote, "For when angry they slay men, and when they please they maim oxen." Jacob himself is therefore associated with the affirmation of intermarriage, while his 2 violent sons are on the other side. The contradictions in the Dinah and Shechem story attest to a real conflict in Israelite opinion, or popular culture, you might even say, over intermarriage as a legitimate way of settling in the land. The legal and prophetic texts were clear in denouncing intermarriage in theological terms, but the narrative traditions reveal the inner conflicts in biblical culture. Which side did the culture believe God was on in these conflicts? The very contradictions between law and narrative suggest that no monolithic theology was possible. All opinions invoke the deity for their own purposes. What else is new? Intermarriage in biblical times, as today, was a kind of code for the general problem of Jewish self-definition. Would the Jews separate themselves religiously and politically and ethnically, or would they find their identity through a process of assimilating with their environment? Historians are, in fact, increasingly convinced that the process by which Israel came to be distinguished from its neighbors was hardly as clear as the Bible seems to portray it. In many respects, the ancient Israelites, or at least many of the tribes, were probably originally Canaanites. Their language derived from Ugaritic, the ancient language of the Canaanites. We might even call biblical Hebrew, and this, of course, is tongue-in-cheek, something like Judeo-Canaanite. The name of the Canaanites' high god, El, was taken over by ancient Israel as one of its names for God. And some of the Canaanites' gods, like Asherah, we heard about this before, were worshipped in the temple itself. So the vexed question of intermarriage captures the larger issue of ancient Israel's complicated place in what the Bible itself refers to as the land of the Canaanites. The issue of intermarriage did not disappear after the biblical period. Josephus recounts examples of Jewish notables from the Hasmonean period who intermarried. His retelling of the story of Baal Peor from the Bible in his Antiquities suggests that he had in mind a contemporary problem of miscegenation, since he enlarges the story greatly beyond its biblical setting. Here, too, the question of sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews represents the private or intimate dimension of the larger question of Hellenization. Once again, language may be seen as a symbol for this question. So, for example, the Jews of the Greco-Roman world, one of the largest and most widespread Jewish communities in all of our history, never developed a Judeo-Greek or Judeo-Latin. No, they spoke and wrote Greek. Perhaps the greatest thinker of this diaspora, Philo of Alexandria, appears to have known very little Hebrew. The Alexandrian Jews know so little Hebrew that they, in fact, required the first translation of the Bible, the Greek Septuagint. Conversely, the Palestinian rabbis, who of course did know Hebrew, incorporated Greek into their writings, so that in order to understand the Talmud, it's often helpful to know Greek. What the rabbis did was not to develop a Judeo-Greek, but rather to transform Hebrew by adding Greek words to it. You might call it a Hellenized Hebrew. The several Jewish cultures of the Greco-Roman period seem to me fascinating precursors or models for our own. Of course, as with all historical analogies, these will be very imperfect, but I think it's important to realize that the challenges that we face, assimilation, acculturation, and intermarriage itself, are not exclusively modern. The Greco-Roman diaspora encompassed many different communities of Jews. Jews were full citizens in Alexandria and enjoyed a higher status than the Egyptian peasants. They participated fully in the life of the city and developed a variety of ways to integrate Judaism with Hellenistic culture. We know from Philo that an ancient version of Reform Judaism developed in Alexandria, a sign of the great pluralism of the long period before the rabbis established their hegemony over Jewish life. The synagogues that Greco-Roman Jews built were adorned with frankly Hellenistic icons, such as Helios, the sun god, who may have been equated with the Jewish Messiah. They wrote in Greek, but much of the literature they produced took up Jewish themes from the Bible and transformed them into genres such as philosophy, drama, and epic poetry familiar to their wider culture. Rather than speaking of Jewish culture apart from Hellenistic culture, it's probably more fruitful to see Jewish culture in this world as a dialect, as it were, of the global culture of Hellenism. We think of diaspora as a Jewish invention, but in the Greco-Roman world, the Jews were not the only ethnic group to live outside its own homeland. The multi-ethnic character of this world, perhaps a little like our own, made it possible for Jews to live outside of the land of Israel as a recognized community. Before the destruction of the temple by the Romans, they typically regarded Jerusalem as their spiritual center, sometimes going there on pilgrimage or sending donations in a kind of ancient version of the UJA. But as Eric Gruen has shown in two remarkable recent books, these Jews felt very much at home in diaspora and exhibited little desire to relocate to their ancient homeland. In a somewhat later period, the Babylonian rabbis even argued that Babylonia was superior to Palestine. Now, of course, this world was not without its dark side, because the Jewish religion was so different from that of the paganism of the Mediterranean, not so much because the Jews believed in one God as the fact that it was a God who couldn't be represented in images. Jews were accused of atheism, in other words, insulting the gods of the city. Maybe nothing has changed. This is an ancient version of the charge that Jews cannot be loyal citizens of the state, because insulting the gods of the city was really an anti-patriotic act more than it was an anti-religious act. Indeed, ancient anti-Semitism often displays disturbing similarities to its modern successor. The examples of the Jewish cultures of the biblical and Greco-Roman periods suggest that the patterns of acculturation, with this I'll come to a conclusion, the patterns of acculturation that we find here in America are not unique in Jewish history, and indeed, if time permitted, I could extend this discussion into the Middle Ages, to the multicultural societies of, certainly of the Arab world, and even, interestingly, I found a case of intermarriage in Ashkenaz of the 11th century. But these earlier examples, that I've discussed here, also raise several important questions for us. First, in antiquity as today, Jews were caught between two conflicting political options. sovereignty in their own land versus minority status in multi-ethnic societies. Yet, as the brief account of the biblical period I've offered here suggests, the ancient Israelites had to share their land with other inhabitants, just as modern Israelis do today. Jewish sovereignty or majority status does not solve the challenge of living in a multi-ethnic or multicultural society, for the state of Israel is no less pluralistic and diverse than our contemporary diaspora communities. Indeed, one might argue that the very fact that Israel defines itself as an ethno-nationalist state makes it harder to reconcile the state's identity with its demographic realities. Second, in a multi-ethnic state like America, Jews are caught between contradictory values. On the one hand, Jews have both endorsed and contributed to the ideal of an integrated society. On the other hand, full integration would surely threaten, or so they believe, their group's survival. This contradiction may be seen most clearly around the issue of intermarriage, which has been the touchstone of the present discussion. It's virtually axiomatic in all Jewish circles, from Orthodox to Reform, that intermarriage is a bad thing. I gather I'm not in this Jewish circle, but I think it is fair to say it's axiomatic in most Jewish circles. The only debate is what to do about it. But if one reads the literature on intermarriage written by other ethnic minority writers, one finds an endorsement of intermarriage as the most effective vehicle for integration. An example of this literature is the legal scholar Rachel Moran's book, Interracial Intimacies, which traces the struggle against anti-miscegenation laws in the United States and argues for removing barriers between races in order to promote intermarriage. This is an idea that many liberal Jews might endorse, as long as it does not apply to themselves. Now, the popular culture with which I began does not usually confront the full complexities of these issues, nor, needless to say, does it provide profound answers. But whether Charlotte must convert to marry Harry, and whether that will make Harry a better Jew, are precisely the questions that Jews cannot afford to avoid as they confront, once again in their history, the challenges of living in a multicultural society. Thank you.